Thank you. All right. So I guess there is FSharp in the title. The slides are actually partly written in FSharp. So you'll see a lot of FSharp, but I actually want to start just by talking about literate programming as a sort of general idea. And I'll move the mouse away so that you can see the picture in a nice shape. So I'll start by talking about literate programming, and then I'll show you what has happened in the FSharp community and how the FSharp community is using some of the ideas. Let me start by sort of a historical perspective here. So I did some Googling just before the talk, obviously. And the idea of literate programming, first of all, this is not literate programming. If you put comments on your properties and the comments say gets or sets the name of the person and the class is named person and the property is named name, that's not very useful. So if you're commenting your code like this, that's definitely not literate programming. If you're commenting your code in a more useful way, that's still not literate programming. And the idea actually comes from Donald Knuth. You can see he's not very happy about the previous example. So what he was imagining in his literate programming book was the idea that you could sort of mix text and program code to write something that you can read as a human. And what he says here is, let us change our traditional attitude to the construction of programs. Instead of instructing the computer what to do, we should concentrate on making the human beings understanding what the computer does. And I think this is really important idea, because when you're writing code, the computer needs to run it, obviously, but very often you come to the code later and you again need to understand what it does. Or in the age of GitHub, you put your code on GitHub and people who want to contribute to it have to understand what it does. So it's really kind of equally important to explain what the program does to humans as it is to explain this to the computer. And Knuth had this system called web. If you look at the quote down there, he actually says, I choose the name web, partly because it was one of the few three-letter words in English that hadn't been applied to computers. So that you can see it's kind of old idea. So in web, what he was doing is that he had this sort of format or language where you could write documents. So you could put text in there and format the text, and you could also put in some program. And in his case, the document formatting was TeX, and the programming language was Pascal. So you could combine these two. And here's a little example. So what you can see here is there's, I think, the @ symbol at the beginning. That's just sort of denotes the beginning of a section. And it's some program to print primes. And then what's in the sort of / square brackets, that's something that's actually not just text, but it's sort of comment for the program. In there, you could use some formatting. And then the program, and this is kind of an interesting thing, he actually had this system where you could name blocks or parts of the program and then reconstruct well, what is saying here is that the whole program is basically some call, or the program print primes, that's sort of a declaration in Pascal. Then he has some constants, and then he says other constants of the program in angle brackets. And when you generate the Pascal code, it will insert something from somewhere in the file in that section. And then there's begin, print the first n prime numbers, which is again referring to some other part of the program. So it's kind of interesting system if you look at if you actually go back to the original idea, which is when people think about literate programming as just writing comments, they actually miss quite a lot from the original interesting idea here. So what can we do in FSharp? In FSharp, we have sort of similar thing, although it's not really implementing Knuth's idea. So what I'll be talking about is a bit different, but some of the ideas are there as well. You can write code, and because we're, I don't know, 40 years later, and we are all hipsters, we write the text in Markdown rather than in LaTeX. And obviously we will not use Pascal, we'll use FSharp instead. So you can write the code as sort of mix of Markdown and FSharp, and then you can do various things with it. You can sort of focus on the FSharp code, and in FSharp, when you have it, you can run it in FSharp Interactive, so you can edit the code, run it immediately, see what it does, or you can just use this with FSharp projects, and then you'll end up with something that you can compile and run. Or we can look at the Markdown parts of this, and in Markdown, we can do a couple of things with it. One is, there's this recent project called FSReveal, which lets you generate slides from literate FSharp programs. So this slide is actually written in FSharp, and it's generated, and it's using reveal.js to show the slides. There's a tool that Evelina was showing earlier when she talked about science, which is this FSLab Journal, and that lets you take your literate programs and it produces a scientific report in a way. And the last box talks about documentation, so you can also use these tools to generate some sort of documentation. And this is actually doing something different than just XML comments, so I'll say a few more things about that later on. So let's see what we have here. The slides, as I said, I'm using here, that's actually written in FSharp. There's a couple of nice things you get from the FSReveal tool. So obviously you can embed FSharp snippets. You can actually embed snippets in other languages and it will colorize them. The nice thing here is that with FSharp you also get tooltips. So if I look at concat, it's a function that takes a string, which is a separator, then it takes a sequence of strings to concatenate, and it gives me a single string. So the snippet here is a fancy version of Hello World with the pipe operator. We take a sequence of strings, concatenate them, and print the result. But also, it can embed the result. So if I jump back to my editor, which is here, well, actually, let me just explain what's happening here. There's like some piece of code at the beginning, which is saying, here's the title and description of the presentation. I can change the theme. I can add some fancy 3D transitions, which I disabled. And here I'm just writing, so I'm mixing Markdown with some embedded HTML because we don't have Markdown for everything. But so on which slide am I? Literate slides with FSReveal. There we are. So this is the slide that I'm showing currently. If I change it to Hello Krakow and save it, there's another thing that's running in the background in the window here. So there's like a build script for your slides that keeps running in the background, and if I switch back and refresh this, then it says hello Krakow in the source code, but also you can see it updated the output. So I didn't have to write the output manually. It has this sort of, the Literate program not just embeds the text there, but it also runs it and lets me embed the snippets. Here's a slightly more interesting example, because embedding text output is, I'm sure Knuth would like that, but we're a couple of years later, so we need to embed charts as well. There's a question.
Can you go back to the code?
Yes.
Where you change to Krakow?
Uh-huh.
So you say define output hello. So what does it?
Yes. So the question is in the code, I have this define output hello. So what does this actually mean? I'll talk more about this later, but we sort of have some special syntax that you can use to tell the tool how to deal with things. So here I have this define output which says capture the output of the snippet, and then later on I have include output which will print the output there. So the next thing I have here is embedding charts, and here I'm using the World Bank type provider. So I say World Bank, and then I access countries, Czech Republic and European Union, and then I'm creating a chart that contains how many people go to universities in Czech Republic and in the EU. This is motivated by some Czech politicians who said that there's too many people in Czech Republic who go to universities, and we need to fix that. And actually, it turns out that so here, European Union is blue. It turns out that there's sort of, in the recent years, we're close to the average of the EU. So it's not like too many people go to universities. And again, this chart is generated automatically, and FSReveal runs the code and embeds the chart.
Can we see the stats for Poland?
That's exactly the thing I wanted to show you. So can we see the stats for Poland?
What's used for charting?
The question is, what's used for charting? It's using the FSharp charting library, which is reasonably nice charting library. It doesn't work. I think this is like one of the, that's one thing in FSharp that doesn't work on Mono, because the library isn't available there. FSharp works on Mono just fine, but the charting library doesn't. And there's a couple of work-in-progress libraries that produce, like, use Google Charts or something like that. So let's see how Poland is doing. Here, the type provider, for those who haven't seen any FSharp before, haven't been to any of the talks, I think all of them mention type providers. But what's happening here is that the World Bank type provider actually connects to the World Bank, and it gets the list of countries, and then it generates this type which has all the countries as properties. So Poland is still here. That's good. Yes, Ukraine is here as well. Scotland isn't there. Not yet. Maybe we should include Scotland as an optional value. But I can get the indicators of Poland, and then I'm actually just going to add Poland as another country here. So that's Poland. What color am I not using?
White and red.
White. Well, I can only do one. So I'll use white. And then I save the file. You can see here it's sort of triggers the update, which reruns the code, and then now we have Poland. So Poland looks overeducated. And I can go back to my code. It doesn't fit anymore, so I would have to, I don't know, write some helper function to make it fit. But I guess the nice thing here is that you don't have to create the chart, do some screenshots, and cut it, and paste it back in PowerPoint, and then you change something, and it doesn't work anymore. So this is using the idea of literate programming, but for one sort of fairly specific task, for just building slides. So I think you've seen how this works. What is actually behind this? There's a couple of things that happened in the FSharp community, and if you haven't seen anything about FSharp, then I think one of the really nice things in the FSharp world is that there's really active community that's quite excited about FSharp, and there's lots of people doing really interesting things. So I think there's this. How many people here come from the C# world or have done some C# before? Quite a lot. I think there's one. I used to do C#, and C# is a fine language. And one thing I sort of found interesting is that when people didn't like something about C#, everyone was like, "Oh, Microsoft should fix this." And this really changes when you come to the FSharp community, where when people don't like things, they just fix it. And FSharp is open source, so you can actually contribute to all the standard toolings, but there's also a great number of additional libraries that people have built to solve some problems they had. And so this slide deck is probably the most technologically advanced slide deck of the conference, but it's using lots of interesting libraries. So FSharp formatting is one library for parsing the FSharp code and formatting the code snippets. It's also using the FSharp compiler service, which is basically a .NET DLL that contains everything that the FSharp compiler does. And this gives you access to the FSharp interactive, so you can tell the service, evaluate this FSharp snippet and give me the output, which is used for the chart embedding. It also gives you access to all the editor tools. So if I actually go back to my FSharp code snippet somewhere, where's my FSharp code snippet? Here's my FSharp code snippet. Then, like here, I get tooltip. This is exactly the same text you can see in Visual Studio or in Xamarin Studio. Well, Xamarin Studio formats it better, but it's the same source because they're all using the same underlying library to access the data. And then FSReveal, which takes this literate script that I was showing here before, and it does some interesting transformations on it. So it looks for these horizontal lines, like the dash, 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 and it also looks for these ones to indicate section beginnings and section ends. So it parses the script, and then it splits it into sections and generates HTML with some Reveal.js specific tags.
Is number of those stars or dashes important?
The question is the number of stars of the dashes important? No. You don't have to have exactly 80. I think that it's just ordinary Markdown, really. So in Markdown, I think you need to have 3 or more, and then it's a horizontal line. And then I was also referencing FSLab, which is this data science library for FSharp, which gives me access to the charts and the type providers and so on. And finally, if I switch to the console, there's fake, which is FSharp make. It's not a fake library, it's actually very real library with something like 3,000 comments on GitHub and over 100 of contributors. And it's pretty amazing library for doing sort of build automation. Many of the FSharp libraries use this, but it's not FSharp specific. I think GitHub uses it for some things as well. And it gives you things like build everything using MS Build, run all the tests, generate documentation, build NuGet package, push the NuGet package to NuGet.com. Fake does automatically retry this because NuGet.com is always down. So it sort of solves all the problems you have with builds. It's also using the Suave project, which is a lightweight web server. So if I find my navigation bar here, it says localhost because it's hosted by the web server. One thing I didn't put in the slide is Packet, which is another really nice library that's happened in the FSharp community recently. Packet lets you get references from NuGet, but it doesn't create the whole crazy thing that NuGet gives you sort of out of the box. So it simplifies the references, basically. But it also lets you reference like individual files from GitHub, which is sometimes nice if you're referencing something really simple and don't want to have like 10 megabytes of references or 100 megabytes. So there's lots of things that have been happening in the FSharp community, and this is sort of putting most of them together. And the other thing I'm using here, or if I go back to the literate programming idea, then the FSharp formatting library actually lets you do this in two different ways. What I was showing before in Visual Studio, that was an ordinary FSharp script. And that's one mode that you can use, where you really just write an ordinary FSharp script, and all your code is just FSharp. It has FSX extension, and the Visual Studio and all the other editors understand this. And then you can use these like open parentheses star comments, which is just a special trick because open parentheses star is normal FSharp comment. So we need to somehow recognize these special blocks. So if you have two stars, you can put markdown in the comment and it will be turned into HTML. And then we have a few triple star comments like define output or include output that are used for controlling how the evaluation and the formatting works. So this is sort of the mode where your program is a valid FSharp code. And the nice thing about this is that you can just open your code in any FSharp editor. The editor will understand it. It will ignore all the special comments. But when you're typing the code, like I was doing here, I can actually do dot and see all the indicators. So I guess the main reason or the main thing why you would use this style is that you actually can use any normal FSharp editor. The other option is that you can write Markdown and just have special FSharp blocks in it. So again, this would be the FSReveal library can deal with this as well. You just write Markdown. GitHub will show it nicely on the page, and then you have special FSharp blocks, and FSReveal will pick these, format the code, and it can run the code as well. So I think there's definitely sort of more that could be done here to make Donald Knuth happy, because what he had in the original web system was really, it wasn't Pascal, it wasn't LaTeX, it was something that had properties from both of the languages. And I think one thing we could do for FSharp in the future would be to have something like this, where you could actually either use something that's Markdown based, but the FSharp compiler actually would understand it. And it's actually not too hard. So
you could put like names in this quotas, like which are always spaces, and like you can make for example variable like named using this quotas and put in these quotas some markdown.
yeah, so the suggestion is to use the FSharp. In FSharp, you can say this. which is just like special variable name. When you put double backticks, you can put anything in there. So you could misuse that in some interesting ways. But I think there's actually, the FSharp compiler is open source, and adding sort of parsing for Markdown wouldn't be too hard. So yeah, I think we can probably do something that's closer to what Donald Knuth had in mind when he was talking about literate programming. All right, so when I was recovering from my addiction to PowerPoint, I started writing all my slides in Markdown. That was really nice. But one thing that you don't get in the Markdown format is that you don't really get the fancy smart art things from PowerPoint where you can create like diagrams. So I thought I should get some diagrams because diagrams are fun. And if you're an FSharp programmer and you have a problem, then you create a domain-specific language in FSharp. So I wrote this little language for creating diagrams. So this is actually the code for the previous diagram. And I'll show this in the... Now I'll describe what's happening here, and then I'll show it in the editor. So what's happening here is that if you look at the lines 8 to 12, that's just saying create a horizontal split with 3 things in it, 1, 2, 3, which are different colors, and then the makebox function creates a rounded rectangle and puts the text over the rounded rectangle. So if I find fun, change it to diagrams are boring, then it will again trigger the runner. And when that finishes, I get a new diagram. The language itself, I'm not going to talk about everything here, but I guess the idea is actually really simple. Because we have this graphics type which says a graphics is either empty, or it's a rectangle, or a rounded rectangle, or an ellipse, or a text. So that's the basic building blocks. And then we can put margin around them, or we can put multiple things over, like render them all in the same area, or we can split the space that we have into multiple parts, and then you can also set the fill, color, and the alignment for text. So this is really all I used here. It's also all I used in the previous diagram, which was showing like Markdown to PDF or Markdown to FSharp. So far I was really only talking about the basically this was talk about how I did my slides. But I have a few other things to say. So one library that's using similar tools is FSLab Journal. And I'm actually going to show you how you can do this. You can install this FSLab Journal template for Visual Studio. So I'm going to create a new one, put it in ctemp. I think FSLab Journal 34 is a great name for my project. You can see I was debugging my installer. That's why I have 33 previous versions. So when you create this, it will create a template, and it also installs the NuGet packages for doing data science with FSharp. It asks me about some security things. Yeah, sure. Enable. It's basically asking whether it should run the type providers. And then when you're done, I'm going to delete the default sample because that one is boring. And then I can add one more. There's a couple of samples to sort of teach you what you can do with this. And this one is interesting because it's also using the R-type provider. Oh, I have some error. Okay, let me restart Visual Studio. The reason why I had to restart Visual Studio is that Visual Studio, when it loads the type provider, it loads it from like one directory, and when you then have a new project that loads the type provider from some other directory, it breaks something. So I get FSharp script where I can just run the runnable FSharp snippets like hash load to load the library. And then what this is doing is that it's again using the World Bank, and it gets the depths for all the countries in Euro area. So we get all the countries for all the depths for all the countries. And you can see I'm actually using the DDL library for working with data frames, and this automatically aligns things and it lets me deal with missing data as well. So here for Latvia they don't have data for this part. So I get this data frame with the data, and then let me do one more thing here. This is just picking the one with the highest depth. Then I'm doing some linear algebra. I want my chart. This is showing the depth for a couple of countries. So I can just write code in my script file and comment it with comments. And if I run this, then it will start sort of console application. We will make this sort of a background process in the next version. So at the moment, this takes sort of quite a lot of time because it actually needs to reference all the libraries again. Question?
Yeah, so which exactly part is responsible for this define output, include value? Because it was in the FS review,
yeah.
Also, and now it's FSLab, so what is the piece of this?
So what is actually dealing with these define output? That's happening in FSharp formatting. So FSharp formatting reads this and it exposes some AST with all these special information. Okay, so I run this, the console app finished, and then I have this nice HTML file here, which shows all the code snippets with tooltips. It also can embed the data frame as a table, so I get some nice view of the table. I can put in LaTeX equations and so on. It's integrated with the math.net library for doing numerical calculations. So I think here I'm just calculating some correlations, or maybe I'm just doing something random to show how this works. But you get nice formatting for matrices as well, embedded charts. And this is what Evelina was showing earlier. It also integrates with the R-type provider, so you can call R from FSharp, and it nicely embeds the outputs. So this is one of the nice uses of the literate programming idea. The other one that many people in the FSharp community are using is for writing documentation. So I think this is example for the documentation for the World Bank type provider, and if I think I can actually click on this. Can I? Oh yes. So now I'm live on the page, and the pattern here is that many of the FSharp libraries, they give you the usual XML comments, and that's sort of useful sometimes if you have like library with lots of functions, but what's generally more useful is to have a tutorial. So this is the World Bank type provider, and the page says, here's a code sample, this is what it does, and there's some description. Or if I go to another type provider, like the CSV type provider, that one has lots of options somewhere. So you can put in lists. So it's really just a tutorial. The problem with writing tutorials for your libraries is that they really quickly get out of sync. You write a tutorial, put it on your blog, and then you change the library, and then you change the library again, and someone goes to your tutorial and nothing works. So I'm going to go to one example here, and this is a tutorial for the DDL library for doing time series and data frame manipulations. And the nice thing here is that we can just run all the code. So I can run all the code here in FSharp Interactive. I think there's some charts as well. This is doing some, like, getting some financial data and comparing how long Facebook exists on the stock exchange, that's the yellow bit, and how long Microsoft exists or something. So you can see Facebook is obviously very young. But the key thing here is I can, when I'm writing documentation, like I'm a programmer, I don't want to write documentation, right? I just want to write code. And here I can write the code, and then I have to write some comments, which I can deal with if it's in my favorite editor, and I just comment. So it makes this, the writing of the documentation actually reasonably friendly, and you don't have to like open Word or Emacs to write LaTeX. You can just do it in the same process that you use when running and writing code. So here I'm using the DDL library as an example, and there's also a script as part of this that actually builds the documentation. So if I run build documentation, that goes over all the scripts and turns them into documentation. So I think I have it open here. That's the documentation I was editing. If I go back to the documentation and do some silly change, I'm just going to write a silly function, hello world, and then I go back and update my documentation. Then it figures out that only one script has changed. It does all the formatting. I think this is taking longer because it's also running all the snippets, and there's some that connect to the internet. But then I get it in my documentation again with tooltips. So that's how you would write documentation using this. The nice thing here is that it's not just like running the thing, but and there's a template called Project Scaffold that gives you all of this out of the box. What you get from there as well is there's some unit tests for the library, and when you make a change to the documentation that wouldn't compile, your tests will fail. So if you change something in your library but don't update the documentation to reflect the change, then you will not be able to release your library because unit tests will fail. And that's really useful because you know that your documentation is always up to date with respect to what your library does. So Project Scaffold is another thing you can use. It's sort of template for creating .NET projects. It works with C# as well. And it gives you a couple of the tools like Fate for doing the simple build automation with NuGet releases. And it also gives you this failing unit tests for documentation and the documentation tools together with sort of automatic publication of the documentation. So if I build the library, it will generate these docs and it will push that to the GH Pages branch on GitHub. So it's perfect if you're using something that's open source. You can change it as well. It's just a template to do whatever you want with the docs, like copy it somewhere on an internal FTP. All right, so to summarize, I think if I go back to what Donald Knuth was doing, I think what I was showing here is not really the same thing, because I use the literate style of programming more for scripts, like doing the, well, I think there's two areas where this works really, really well. If you're doing some data science or some data analytics, it's really useful to produce reports of what you're doing. If you're writing any calculations that someone else should understand, then this is really the best way to document your process. And I also use this for the walkthroughs in documentation, which works really well as well. And obviously, as you can see from my slides, it works really nicely for building slide decks. How can we do something like what Donald Knuth was doing with his web systems for sort of building the whole complex software using literate programming? I think that's still an interesting problem. So if you want to learn more about this, I'll clean up the slides and post them somewhere. So you can follow me on Twitter. There's also a couple of links. If you're interested in more F#, go to fsharp.org. And we also have this FSharp Works company. That's me and a couple of other F# people. So if you want to use F# and need some help getting started, then let us know. And finally, thanks to Carl Kim, who did the FSReveal project that basically I was talking about, or I was using in the whole talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Do you know some example of real-world project which uses F# literate programming?
So the question is, yeah, you could, yeah. I don't have to repeat it because everyone hear it. The question was, I can't answer questions without repeating the question first. I think so I used it for the journals and the notebooks and for the documentation. So many of the libraries that use this for documentation are real-world libraries. The DDL library that I was editing here, that's actually used by, and it's sort of funded and developed by BlueMountain Capital, which is a hedge fund in New York. If someone uses it sort of internally for some like internal reports, I don't really know. I think like putting the libraries together, that's a fairly recent thing that we did. So I'm not sure if there's anyone who sort of built something on top of this and they use it as like internal reporting system.
Isn't your page like working on similar manner?
Sorry?
Isn't your web page not working on similar?
Oh yeah, there's FS blog project which people use for blogging, and that uses the same tools. So it's used by quite a few people for various things. I'm not sure. I haven't managed to sell it to anyone yet. So nobody's.
Because it's open source.
It's open source. That's true. But I think we actually talked with BlueMountain about using that for some of their internal scripts where they do some data analysis, which produces reports that they send around by emails. So turning that to use something like this was really interesting option for them. But I'm not sure if they did it already or not yet.
Can we embed the F# interactive, previously prepared with additional, let us say, data types?
Well, it's open source, and this would be an interesting project. It would actually be really, really easy because F# interactive is available just as a DLL, and I suppose you would have to do some like server-client communication that would call F# interactive and then print the results. But I like this idea. What's your GitHub ID?
Well, I want to, as I'm not sure about my level of my coding.
That's okay.
You get this issue already.
No,
It's assigned to you.
this will happen. We'll assign it to you after the talk.
I will Twitter if I start.
Perfect.
Hi, is there a D3 integration with this?
Sorry?
Is there D3 integration?
Oh, is there a D3 integration? So I haven't used D3 here. I think there's like all the tools that you would need to make it happen are there, because there's FunScript, which translates FSharp to JavaScript, and it has this mechanism for referencing JavaScript libraries. So I've used something like that for doing like WebGL with FSharp, and the same trick would work for doing D3 with FSharp. So that's another work item that we have assigned already during the class.
And about if I have the interactive D3, will it conflict with those other thingies there?
Do you mean the diagrams or?
I mean, you have arrows to go to the previous slide and so on, but maybe I have an interactive D3 that I want to command within the keyboard.
If I had interactive D3 in the slides, what would happen? I don't know. Do we have some JavaScript experts in the room? It's using FReveal. It's using FReveal.js. So I think FReveal.js works with D3. The arrows only sort of capture, I think, keyboard like arrow, but I can still click anywhere and do whatever I want. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? No?
You mentioned that was going to be FSharp later.
Sorry?
You mentioned that was going to be FSharp.
Oh yeah, that's an off record.
Do you off-record announcement?
Sorry?
Do you off-record announcement, please?
I don't have any announcement. But we also have stickers.
Tomas, I have a question.
Yes.
I just been on Scala talk, and they running sliders in REPL. It's possible to run FSReveal in REPL somehow. Because they just showing slides and just executing code immediately.
Let's see. I close this. I go back to my source code. There's my sample. Well, I could. So this is all run using fake. So if I go back here and open my fake build script, then it gets stuck. I think it will run. I'm kind of curious though. Let me just.
If you're showing your presentation in REPL,
that's like I'm sure we can do that. Keep running. What is this?
Even sliders, everything.
Generate deck. Start. Look, there's start web server. I can run this. I'm sure this will fail miserably. Start web server. Oh yeah. Because I already have this one running. That's easy to fix. Now this one is killed. There it is. No. This is just wrong URL. Oh yeah, now I started it from the REPL. I would have to sort of inline it in the REPL, but it's definitely doable. We can do everything that Scala people do.
I think it was the best way to summarize this talk. Thank you very much once more, and see you in 10 minutes on lightning talks this room. Thank you.
And we have type providers.